I'd made that ridge my home for 11 years before the convoy passed beneath it. Through all those quiet seasons, the only faces I saw were the postal drone twice a month, and once a hapless land surveyor whose truck bogged down in the lower creek crossing, needing my tractor to haul it out. That afternoon, when engine noise drifted up from the pass road below, I stepped onto the porch and watched the way a man watches storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Something worth noting. Nothing that demanded action. 9 vehicles crawled along that road, low-slung and plated in armor, the kind of convoy the Velsari used when transporting someone of importance through ground not fully secured. I knew their shape from news broadcasts. Past that, what I understood of the Velsari came from general talk, a smaller sovereignty, pressed between 2 larger, rougher powers, keeping to themselves mostly, their court shifting along the resettlement corridor for close to a year while some border conflict several systems away got sorted by people with more patience for such matters than I had. I went back to my work. None of it was mine to worry over. 41 ewes were near their lambing time, and the north pasture fence wanted mending before weather turned. And that day, the air held a flat gray scent, telling me the change was coming sooner than the forecast promised. I should explain who I was before that day, since it colors everything that came after. And because I've noticed folks hearing this tale tend to picture more of me than was ever true. I wasn't a soldier. Nobody's notion of a hero. 30 years I'd spent as a stonemason down in the valley towns, until my knees finally gave out decent, plain work, foundations and walls, and the odd chimney job. When Annie passed pneumonia, fast and unforgiving, 11 winters back, I sold our shared home and bought this ridge in its place, needing quiet enough that stillness wouldn't feel like blame. I kept sheep because sheep never inquire how you're managing. I mended fences because a fence either holds or fails. And there's something restful in a problem that plain. I hadn't held to proper conversations with another person, let alone an alien, in longer than I'd bothered to track, and I'd told myself I liked it that way. So, as that convoy moved below the ridge, what I felt wasn't so much curiosity as a mild disquiet, the sensation of something enormous, brushing too close to a life. Deliberately kept small, the way a truck passing too near feels on a narrow road. I took note. I let it pass. That was, as far as I knew that afternoon, the sum total of my part in whatever the Velsari court was handling, and I returned to my wire and posts without any inkling of what the night would ask of me. By 4 that afternoon, as the wind picked up seriously, I'd nearly stopped thinking about the convoy. I was working the north fence, driver and wire in hand, when Primera Kahuk feigned, against the gusting wind, vehicles moving at speeds that road couldn't safely handle. Then, quiet. 20 minutes on, 3 of those transports came flying back up the pass road the other way, amber lights flashing, not slowing for anything. I didn't think more on it until dusk, coming down off the ridge to find a man waiting at my gate. Small and solid, military bearing, plainly not Velsari. The cut of his jacket gave that away, and he carried himself with the stiffness of someone working hard to hide how scared he was. "Have you seen 2 children?" Not really a question. A man who'd asked this 40 times over already, bracing himself to hear no again. "No," I told him. "What's going on?" He laid it out quick, in the way people do once they've told the same thing so many times the words have gone smooth. The royal convoy had been escorting the Velsari court through the corridor under a yellow tier alert. Nothing certain. Just enough radio chatter to unsettle the escort. Near the second switchback, a vehicle carrying 2 royal children swerved to avoid road debris and struck the shoulder. Nobody hurt in the collision itself, but amid the rush to get everyone moving again under alert conditions. In the dark, with the storm bearing down, someone miscounted heads. The 2 girls were missing when the convoy reached the rally point 4 kilometers further along. "How old are they?" "7. Twins." He glanced past me toward the high pasture, that long gray country climbing into the clouds. "Thermal scanners are up, but this terrain," he left it unfinished. Didn't need to say more. I'd worked that ground 11 years, and knew it well. It absorbed thermal signals completely. All that fractured granite trapping the day's warmth and scrambling every reading. "There's a shelter," I said, "down in the lower pasture. Stone walls, part of a roof still standing. If they headed downhill instead of up, that's the first thing they'd come across. He looked me over the way a man does when weighing whether to trust a stranger's knowledge of the land over his own equipment. Then he glanced skyward, sleet already starting, and made the only sensible choice. Take me there. I didn't wait for him to call it in. I grabbed my heavy coat and hand lamp and told him to keep pace if he could, since I knew this land after dark and he didn't. And 2 children already exposed 2 hours to this weather couldn't afford me waiting on procedure. The ground between my house and the lower pasture turns treacherous once the sun's gone. It falls away in 3 places where old quarry cuts weaken the soil, and one stretch runs beside a dry stone wall with a 6-foot drop on the other side that you learn to respect quickly or learn the hard way. I'd covered that path 10,000 times in daylight, maybe 100 after dark. Mostly during lambing, when a troubled A-way doesn't wait for convenient hours. I moved down it now, quicker than good judgment allowed, lamp beam swinging ahead, sleet slicing sideways, hard enough to burn exposed skin, and somewhere in my chest a sensation I hadn't felt in 11 years stirred back to life, uninvited, that particular cold fear of knowing something small and living was out there, running low on time, and that I might not reach it soon enough to make a difference. The officer fell behind within the first 200 meters, which I anticipated and held no grudge over. He didn't know this ground, and there wasn't time to teach him. I shouted back that I'd locate them and send word, then pressed on. The lower pasture shelter was a half-collapsed structure my grandfather built for emergency lambing. 3 walls of dry stacked stone and a tin roof that had given up on one corner long before I was born. Not much to it, but it blocked the wind. And that was all it needed to do. I found them by smell before sight. Faint smoke curling from within, meaning one of them had somehow managed, through instinct or pure desperation, to get a fire going from the kindling I kept, stored there for the sheep. That told me something about them before I ever saw their faces. They were pressed together in the driest corner beneath a torn piece of coat, the fire down to little more than embers. Damp wood, weak draft, the kind of fire a scared child builds when she's doing everything correctly, and it still falls short. I moved in slowly, dropping to my knees so as not to tower over them, and the smaller girl, though the size difference between them was slight, recoiled against the stone with an expression I recognized from somewhere long past, on a different kind of frightened creature. The other one positioned herself in front of her sister, inserting her own small frame between the stranger and the smaller girl without a moment's pause. Her hands shook badly, her lips had turned a worrying shade, and she stayed put, regardless. "I'm not going to hurt either of you," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, the tone you'd use calming a startled A. "My name's Corin. This is my land. You're both nearly frozen, and that fire's dying. I've got a proper one burning half a kilometer up at my house. That's the entirety of why I'm here." Neither responded. The one guarding her sister, Mira, I'd learn her name later, had eyes like struck flint, pale gold touched with gray, and they stayed locked on me even as her teeth clattered loudly. I didn't ask their identities. I'll be truthful about that, since people have wondered since why it never crossed my mind. And the honest answer is this. 2 children were freezing on my property. That was the whole of what mattered right then. Everything else could wait its turn. "Can either of you stand and walk?" The younger one, Sale, gave a small broken whimper and shook her head, and I understood the reason once I looked closer. Her ankle had swollen badly against a delicate formal shoe, never meant for rugged terrain, likely twisted while scrambling down from the road in darkness. Mira could manage walking. Sale couldn't, not on that injury. Not in this storm, not that far. So I picked her up and carried her. I'll state that simply, since there isn't much more to it. I lifted a terrified 7-year-old with no reason at all to trust me, and she stiffened against me for the first 30 seconds before something loosened, and she buried her face in my shoulder and clung on. Mira stayed at my side the entire climb, near enough to grip the back of my coat, her jaw tight, studying me the way you study someone you haven't yet made up your mind about. Half a kilometer stretches between that shelter and my house, All of it uphill, over ground that turns to greasy clay, the second rain falls, and I won't claim it was simple going. Sail wasn't much weight compared to the bales and posts I hauled regularly, but a frightened child braces wrong against you. Every muscle rigid against a fall that isn't happening, and that resistance wears on a person worse than actual weight ever would. Twice, her trembling settled into something quieter and considerably more worrying. And both times I kept up a steady stream of talk, nothing that mattered, just the sound of my voice, describing the fire waiting for us, the dog who'd be delighted by unexpected late-night guests, because I'd learned years back, with lambs too far gone to save ease, that the worst thing you permit is silence closing over something, still struggling to hold on. Keep talking. Keep them reaching for something. What I said mattered far less than that, I kept saying it. Mira never asked to be carried, though by the time we reached my gate, her own steps had gone unsteady. She simply kept up, quiet, alert, a small determined shape in the lamplight, refusing to be the one needing rescue while her sisters still did. Somewhere in that half-kilometer climb, I grasped something about her that took me much longer to understand about her mother in that family. Caring for the other came before caring for oneself, as natural as breathing. No one had to teach them that. It was simply how they'd come into the world. The officer caught up with us partway, out of breath, reaching toward the radio on his collar, and I told him plainly, warm them first, questions later. Something in how I said it must have registered, because he didn't argue, just moved ahead and pushed my gate open. Inside, I got the fire built up right. Good dry birch that lights fast and burns clean, and helped both girls out of their soaked clothing behind a blanket hung over a chair for privacy, offering what I had my own flannel shirts, far too large, sleeves rolled up several times, and the quilt from my own bed, the one Annie had stitched together the winter before she passed, blue and gray patches gone soft from years of washing. Nothing elaborate to feed them bread, butter, a tin of soup heated on the stove, set down plainly, the way you'd feed anyone cold who'd had a hard time of it. Mira observed every action with that same guarded, flinty stare, as if waiting to uncover the hidden cost. There's no cost here, I told her, recognizing the look. I want nothing from you. Eat. She did, hesitant at first, then like someone hungrier than she'd admitted, sale ate, les her cala still por ankle propped, on a folded towel with a cold compress, made from a bag of frozen peas, since that's what I had available, and she didn't complain about it either. A particular stillness settles over a room once the immediate danger has passed and slower healing begins. I sat with them through it a good while, wrapping sails ankled properly with my sheep first aid supplies, clean firm but not restrictive, while Mira watched every movement of my hands closely, the way someone does who's learned that studying a person's hands reveals more about them than their words. You've done this before, she finally said, her voice having thawed somewhat, from chattering to something more level, though still cautious. More times than I could count. Sheep manage to hurt themselves regular as anything out here. Bad step, wire fence, fox that got greedy. You either learn to wrap an injury or you lose the animal. We are not sheep, she said, and there was something in it not quite hostile. More like she was testing whether I understood the distinction, whether she was a problem to be handled or a person to be cared for. No, I agreed. You're worth considerably more effort than a sheep, and you're getting exactly that. That seemed to ease something in her, because she turned back to her soup and asked nothing further for a spell. The officer wanted to move them right away, back to the rally point, but the storm had settled in hard by then genuine bad weather, the kind that grounds vehicles and traps convoys, and even he could tell it wasn't a night for dragging to worn-out children back down a mountain road in darkness. He radioed ahead that the girls were safe, warm, fed, and that the weather had them stuck until morning. Even through the static, I caught something on the other end that sounded like a woman's voice, giving way. Afterward, he turned to me. Her Majesty wants to come tonight herself. I told her the roads are impassable. Then she waits for morning like anyone else would have to, I said, not harshly. Tell her they're warm fed and staying exactly where they should. He passed that along, nearly word for word, then fell silent, listening. When he faced me again, his expression was one I didn't yet understand. She says, thank you, he told me. She says she won't forget it. I didn't dwell on that then. People say such things in the middle of a terrifying night without necessarily meaning to be held to it. I turned back to the girls. The hardest part of that night wasn't the weather, it was staying alert. Sale's color troubled me, not severely. The medical supplies confirmed that much, but her recovery was slow. The sort of chill that lodges in a small body and takes its time departing. I'd attended enough near frozen lambs to recognize that the real danger isn't the cold itself but what comes after. If an exhausted body sinks too quickly into too deep a sleep and can't climb back out the way it should. So I kept both girls from slipping into deep sleep right away. I kept the fire consistent. My voice, steady and low, offered small amounts of warm broth every 20 minutes, whether they wanted it or not. Kept Sale's foot raised and her compress fresh, watched the color of their lips and the pattern of their breathing the way you'd watch a way through a hard delivery. Mira resisted sleep the longest, upright against the hearthstones with her sister's head resting on her lap, her flint eyes following my every movement, until sometime past midnight, she finally asked the only question Ido had voiced all night. Why are you helping us? I weighed how to respond truthfully, because scared as she was, she deserved that more than empty comfort. Because you were freezing, and I had the means to change that, I said. That's reason enough. Always has been. She examined me a long moment, firelight playing across features. I'd only later realize belonged to a girl raised from birth to search for hidden angles in every act of kindness, because so few ever arrived free of charge. I watched her search for the catch in mine, and find none, and something in her posture eased, the way a fence post settles once it's been driven properly straight. Sale hates the cold, she said, as though that clarified something, and perhaps it did. Then we'll make sure she's warm, I said. That's not complicated. It's the easiest thing there is, once you've made up your mind to do it. She fell quiet again, watching the flames, one hand drifting slowly through her sister's hair the way I pictured someone once doing for her. Then, in a quieter voice, she asked something else. Do you have kids of your own? It was the kind of question that catches a man unprepared, even 11 years removed. No, I said. My wife and I hoped for them. It never came to pass, and she died before we'd fully accepted that. I hadn't spoken those words to another living person in years, and I'm still not sure why I told a frightened 7-year-old by firelight, except that the honesty she'd shown me seemed to call for the same in return, and there was no one there to put on a face for. Mira regarded me a long moment, then said simply, I'm sorry, with the bluntness children haven't yet been trained out of, and returned her attention to the fire, and I found the quiet that followed suited me just fine. I kept the broth coming through the small hours regardless of what either wanted. The same discipline learned tending lambs too cold for comfort. You don't let a body quit warming itself just because the shivering has eased, because the danger doesn't always vanish just because it appears to. I checked Sale's color with every refill, watched her breathing against her sister's shoulder, kept the fire steady instead of blazing, since too much heat too quickly does more harm than good to a chilled body. There's a rhythm this kind of work demands. Patience earned the hard way, lamb after lamb, bad night after bad night, until it had become more instinct than deliberate thought. Around 2 in the morning, I finally allowed them proper sleep. Their color decent by then, breathing steady, the worst of the storm having eased enough that I trusted the night to hold steady. I banked the fire to burn low and slow through until dawn and sat in the chair opposite the hearth, coat across my knees, not sleeping, simply watching them breathe, Mira's arms still draped protectively over her sister even unconscious. Sale's small hand nodded into Annie's quilt, and I thought, not for the first time in that house, that some nights the only real job is staying awake so someone else doesn't have to. Wind continued outside, and twice I caught the distant sound of vehicles that never got closer. Search teams covering the wrong terrain, and I thought about signaling them and chose not to. Getting up from that chair, disturbing the fragile peace we'd earned, seemed a greater risk than letting the search continue a while more while the girls got the rest they needed. I'd already told the officer our location. That would have to be sufficient. My task through those hours was simpler and smaller than search and rescue. Keep the fire going, keep the room heated, stay still. Let two worn-out children sleep without dread of what might come next. I don't recall choosing to drift off. I remember gray lights spreading across the window and vehicles approaching more cautiously this time, working their way over ground, still greasy from the storm. and I remember standing up stiff and careful not to disturb either girl, going to stand in my own doorway in the early light to see who had come. The vehicles arriving at my gate that morning weren't the armored kind from before a single transport. Plain and quick, and a woman stepped out before it had entirely stopped, moving the way people move after a sleepless night, having burned through fear entirely and come out the other side into something without a name yet. I recognized her before anyone spoke. Certain people carry a particular presence, even half undone by worry, even wrapped in a simple traveling coat with her hair coming loose from whatever style it started in a calm beneath the urgency, someone used to being observed, and used to observing right back, steadily. Queen of Vieth Solinval had pale violet-gray skin gone nearly colorless from the night just past. Dark hair woven with fine silver lineage marks now half undone from its braid, and eyes, matching her daughter's, struck flint gold and gray, red-rimmed, wide, fastened on my doorway as though dreading what she might not discover there. I moved aside to let her see past me. The girls still lay sleeping by the hearth, tangled together beneath Annie's quilt, the fire burned down to a steady orange glow, Mira's arms still resting over her sister, both breathing slow and warm. I've seen a great deal in my years, and precious little of it halted me the way the sound the Queen made in that doorway did. Not quite a cry, smaller than that, and heavier. A sound wrenched from somewhere a sovereign isn't supposed to allow anyone to witness. She crossed my small room in 3 quick steps and dropped to her knees on the hearthstone, indifferent to her coat, indifferent to everything, pulling both daughters against her at once. They woke into it, disoriented, then aware, then crying, the particular relieved crying of someone who'd suppressed it all night for lack of space to let it out. Sale's injured ankle made her wince, and the Queen adjusted without thinking, the way a mother's hands know how before her mind catches up to the reason, holding them both anyway. Her face pressed into the top of Mira's head, her shoulders trembling in a way I understood she'd never have allowed before any court anywhere, and was permitting now because no court existed here, only a stone floor, a banquet fire, and 2 who were finally warm. I stood back near the door and let it unfold. It wasn't my place to be part of it. Some time passed before she raised her head. When she did, her eyes found mine across the room, and truthfully, I didn't fully grasp what I was witnessing. Grief still working through her, relief not yet settled, and underneath both something I'd only seen once before. The morning after Annie's surgery turned out better than any doctor had dared expect. That specific look of someone realizing the worst had not come to pass, and trying to figure out what to do with all that feeling at once. "You found them," she said, her voice worn from the night, each word chosen with visible care. "Mira found the shelter and had a fire started before I ever got there," I said, since it was the truth and she deserved to hear it. "I just carried Sale the rest of the way and kept the fire going. They told me." She glanced down at her daughters, both quiet now, leaning into her, watching me with their mother's same level gaze. "They told me you never asked who they were before lifting her, that you fed them before asking anything at all, that you stayed awake the entire night so they wouldn't," she paused, continued, quieter, "so they wouldn't slip too far under." "Seemed like the sensible order," I said. "Warmth first, questions after. I've kept lambs alive that way more times than I can count, and a child isn't so very different as far as that's concerned." Something shifted across her face, not offense, to be clear, though I worried briefly it might read that way, likening a princess to livestock, closer to astonishment, as if the sheer simplicity of it reached somewhere a grander gesture never would have. She stood, shifting Myra onto one hip, keeping a steady hand on Sale, who couldn't put weight on the injured ankle, and surveyed my small house. The worn furniture, the quilt that wasn't fine, but was warm, the fire kept burning all night for 2 children she'd never met before. Then she studied me for what felt like a long while. "I have a question for you," she said, "and I want the honest answer. Not what you assume I'd prefer to hear. That's the only kind I offer. Did you know who they were, in that shelter?" "No." "Found out they were Vilsari from your officer on our way up the hill. Found out who you were when you stepped from that transport just now. Far as I was concerned in that shelter, they were 2 frightened, freezing children on my land, and that was all I needed to know." She nodded slowly, as if she'd anticipated exactly that answer but needed to hear it stated anyway. Then she spoke a few words in an unfamiliar language, gentle, formal in tone, and Mira, still resting against her mother's hip, echoed them back quietly, carefully, watching me the entire time. Velsura then, the queen said, noting my puzzled expression. It resists clean translation. The closest I can render it in your language is, my house has seen you. My house names you. My house will not set you aside. Her gaze remained steady now, the tremor gone from her. It isn't spoken casually, rarely spoken at all. I've said it perhaps a dozen times across 30 years on the throne, always to those who gave my house something no wealth could purchase. I wasn't after gratitude, I said, wanting that clear before things went further. I understand, she said. That's exactly why I'm saying it. The remainder of that morning held little in the way of dramatic events. The officer returned to confirm the girls were fit to travel once Sale's ankle had been properly assessed. Medics fussing over both while I brewed tea, nobody quite finished. The queen sat at my kitchen table, scarred, plain. The one Annie and I had bought used 30 years prior. One daughter in her lap, the other leaning into her shoulder, and for a stretch none of them said much of anything. They didn't need to. The quiet carried its own significance. I kept myself occupied at the stove, uncertain what else to do with my hands, sensing somehow that a queen sitting undone with relief in a stranger's kitchen needed less an audience than the ordinary sounds of a household continuing on, a kettle, a fire being tended, the small domestic hum of life proceeding, reminding her that the worst had passed and the world kept moving regardless. I'd learned that myself in the year following Annie's passing, that sometimes the kindest gesture anyone offered was simply continuing to make toast in the next room, letting me sit with my grief at my own speed. At one point, the medic, a young woman with equipment unfamiliar to me, asked to check me over as well, given I'd been out in that same storm carrying a child half a kilometer uphill. I waved her off, told her I'd worked that hill through 40 winters harder than this one, and would be fine. The queen, watching this, said something quiet to the medic in her own language, and the young woman came anyway, taking my pulse and temperature with brisk, gentle efficiency that permitted no further argument, eventually declaring me stubborn but sound, which satisfied everyone except me. Before departing, the queen asked to see the lower shelter where her daughters had reached safety on their own in the dark, and I walked her down while the girls rested under the medic's supervision. She stood a long while inside that half-collapsed stone structure my grandfather had built before either of us existed. Studying the cold ashes of the small fire Mira had managed to start with trembling hands and damp wood and nothing but pure determination, running her fingers once across the dry stone wall as though trying to comprehend it. She has never in her life built a fire, the queen said softly. Never had reason to, and she built one well enough to keep her sister alive until you came. She did the difficult part, I said. I only finished it. She looked at me then with an expression I didn't yet have a word for. Wouldn't fully understand until I came to know her better in the months that followed. There are people within my court, she said, who have spent entire lifetimes positioning themselves to earn exactly this kind of recognition from me. You had no idea who I was. No idea what this might be worth to you. You simply did the obvious, decent thing all night through, and would have done the same for any 2 children who wandered onto your land, royal blood or not. That is rarer than you realize, and worth more to me than anything those others have ever offered. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I said very little, and she seemed to understand why. She departed that morning with both daughters settled warmly in the transport. Sale's ankle properly bound, Mira watching me through the rear window until the vehicle turned onto the corridor road and disappeared. I genuinely believed that might be the end of it. An odd night. A story for the feed store for a year or two, then silence again. It wasn't the end of it. 3 weeks later, a formal letter arrived by courier, sealed with wax, the deep violet blue of Velsari house colors. Addressing me by name, Corin Hale, no title attached, since I held none and they made no pretense otherwise, inviting me to the court's receiving hall for what the letter described. In careful compact standard translation, as a matter of public record, I nearly stayed home. Standing before crowded rooms has never come naturally to me, and the thought sat uneasily through those 3 weeks. A quiet dread beneath the ordinary rhythm of lambing and fence work and the changing season. But that morning, I found myself pressing my one good jacket anyway. The same one worn to Annie's funeral, and almost nowhere since it, telling myself it was a small thing. An hour or two spared from a life with plenty of hours to spare. And that the girls deserved whatever this occasion was meant to be, even without my fully understanding it yet. I arrived in that jacket feeling entirely misplaced, standing at the foot of a hall constructed from pale stone and tall glass, letting daylight flood through clean and bright, no shadows left for ceremony to hide in, and watched Queen Abvieth Solenvel stand before her gathered court advisors, House representatives, the officer from that night among them, both daughters beside her. Sales Ankolong sealed. Mira's eyes locating mine the moment I entered. The hall caught me off guard. I'd braced for something heavier, dark, stone and aging banners. The sort of space built to remind a visitor how small he was. Instead, it was flooded with light. Plain pale wood underfoot, seating arranged in a broad arc rather than rows, so no one present felt themselves looking up at anyone else. I learned afterward this had been deliberate, a decision the Queen made years back, believing that a court which conceals its business in shadow grows too comfortable with matters that prefer shadow. I thought of my own house, plain and lit by firelight, and felt less out of my depth than expected. She recounted to the assembly what had happened, plainly, without embellishment, much the way I'd have told it myself. The crash, the mist count, the closing storm, 2 children stranded on an unfamiliar hillside as light failed. Then, she told them what came next. And when she reached the part about the fire I'd kept burning through the night, the broth given every 20 minutes, the choice not to ask who they were before acting, her voice didn't crack the way it had in my doorway, but something in it held the same weight. I have been offered gifts by sovereigns and warlords alike across 30 years upon this throne, she said, given in hopes of binding my favor to their purposes. I have learned to recognize the shape of a kindness, carrying a price, having received so very many. This man offered nothing of the sort. He saw 2 freezing children and made them warm. That is the whole of the exchange, beginning to end, and it is the rarest gift I have ever been given. She turned to address the assembly more directly, resting a hand briefly on Mira's shoulder. I want to be exact about what took place, since precision matters to me more than any flattering version of events. My daughters were lost due to a failure in my own escort's protocol under my own command, during an alert I myself ordered. That failure belongs to this court, and to me. What corrected that failure in the end was not a larger guard, nor swifter vehicles, nor any of the measures I've spent 30 years constructing to keep my household safe. It was one man holding no standing in any court anywhere, who happened to be awake on a cold hillside and chose to remain so through an entire difficult night for 2 children who owed him nothing at all. I would ask this assembly to sit with that thought a moment, because I have... She spoke those words again, then, formally, before the entire assembly, and the chamber settled into a stillness that told me even those unfamiliar with the old tongue sensed the weight being placed within it. Corin Hale, my house has seen you. My house names you. My house will not set you aside. I had no speech ready, hadn't anticipated needing one, so I offered the only thing that felt genuine. Standing there in my one good jacket in a hall built for grander men than myself. I'd do the same again tomorrow, I said, for your daughters or any 2 children freezing on my hill. That's not something a person should need thanked for, but I'll accept the thanks since you've clearly gone to the trouble of meaning it. Mira smiled at that. I discovered later she rarely did. Not easily, certainly not for strangers. The Queen's eyes glistened, though her composure held, in the way I'd come to recognize as typical of her, a woman who'd spent 30 years learning to bear weight before a room and release it only where it was safe too. Part of what followed afterward I only grasped in fragments. Formal wording entered into the sovereign record regarding a standing acknowledgement, meaning, as the officer explained over tea afterward, which I drank mostly out of courtesy, that I would always be welcomed at that court without need for petition, that my name now carried weight, there I'd done nothing to earn beyond that single night, and that the weight wouldn't fade or be withdrawn except by my own decision. I didn't entirely grasp what that meant then, and I'm not sure I fully grasp it even now, except that it's proven true in the smaller ways that count. A letter answered the same week it's sent. a door opening without requiring explanation. Afterward, in the quieter side chamber where formality dissolved, Sale approached with the particular gravity only a 7-year-old can summon, extending a small smooth stone. Grace shot through with one thin vein of gold. "From the shelter," she said. "I picked it up while you were carrying me." "I don't remember picking it up. Found it in my pocket afterward." She pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers over it with both her small hands. "Mother says you keep the things that matter even when you don't recall choosing to." I still keep that stone. It rests on the windowsill above my kitchen sink, right where Annie used to keep her good teacups. And most mornings, it's the first thing my eyes land on. Kettle heating, gray gold light climbing over the ridge. The Queen found me alone for a moment before I departed that day. While the girls were occupied elsewhere with some piece of court business too tedious to hold their interest. "I want you to understand something about that night," she said, because I don't believe I expressed it clearly enough at the time, standing in my doorway, half-end on with relief. "I have spent 30 years building walls and guards and protocols around those two girls. Because the universe isn't always gentle toward a sovereign's children, and until that night I believed the strength of those walls measured entirely how well I protected them. What that hillside taught me is that all the walls in existence won't always suffice, and that what ultimately saved my daughters wasn't a wall at all. It was a stranger's choice, made within a few seconds in the cold and dark, to be the sort of person who doesn't pass by a fire that needs tending. I cannot manufacture more of that. Cannot purchase it or command it into being. I can only recognize it when I encounter it and try to prove worthy of having found it." I didn't know how to respond, so I told her plainly that I hadn't experienced it as a decision at all. Not truly, not in any sense that felt like choosing. It had simply been the next right thing before me, the same as countless other nights tending something small and cold and afraid on that hill. Handled the same way I'd have handled any of them, without weighing it first. "Yes," she said, "that's precisely what gives it the worth it holds. The Queen and I write to each other now, twice each season or so, nothing formal. Updates on the lambing, how the girls are growing, a question about the shelter wall I finally got around to repairing that spring. She visits the hill once yearly, always in early autumn, always without the armored convoy, just the one plain vehicle and her daughters, who race straight for the lower pasture, each visit to check whether the shelter's still there, and it always is, since I never had the heart to tear it down. Mira has taken these past 2 visits to asking me to teach her things: how to properly lay a fire, how to wrap a sprain, how to mend a fence post so it survives winter. I don't know what she'd grow into. A girl born to a throne, yet raised partly on a hillside's worth of plain lessons. But I no longer carry the worry I did that first night, wondering whether either of them would see morning. Sale, meanwhile, mostly wants to know whether the lambs have names, yet disappointed each year when I remind her I don't name livestock, bringing me a fresh list of names regardless, written in careful looping letters, just in case I ever change my mind. Folks ask me sometimes, down at the feed store, what it's like knowing a queen, having princesses visit your hill once a year, as though it's the most natural thing in the world. I give them the same answer I gave her that first morning, standing in my own doorway, with 2 cold children breathing easy by the fire behind me. And it remains the truest thing I can say about any of it. I didn't do anything remarkable. I simply refused to look away.